Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I wanted to focus on one of the most important words in any negotiation, and that word is compromise. And this is because any negotiation without compromise is not really a negotiation at all. And one of the main reasons why people get tripped up in any negotiation is that they can quite often go into it without understanding what it is they need to compromise on, and also what are the consequences to them of agreeing to any particular compromise. And so when you fail to establish those things, what it is you can or cannot compromise to, and what the consequences are, then you tend to have a rather messed up negotiation strategy. Now, sometimes it can also lead to a false illusion of progress, because people may agree to a set of compromises without thinking it through properly. The consequences of those compromises, let's say negative consequences, because they usually are, may not materialize until later on, sometimes well after the negotiations had concluded. And when that happens, then then it becomes more clear that negotiation had failed, because the people doing it failed to understand the objectives and failed to have a proper strategy to get to it. So that's the case when it comes to negotiations. The exact same is true for any politician operating in politics in any kind of democracy. Because to be a successful politician, you have to understand the importance of compromise. You also have to understand the importance of when it is to not compromise. And so this is going to be the theme for this particular video. I am going to talk about Sunak, because he has had to reach certain compromises in order to become Prime Minister. And so the question arises, will those compromises come back to bite him? The further question also arises is, what compromise does he yet have to make in order to secure his objectives? And so I think by looking at those future compromises as well as some of the current ones, we can get a bit of a sense of some of the problems that are coming down Rishi Sunak's way, and some of the challenges he's going to have in terms of trying to be a successful Prime Minister. So with that all said, let's get into it. Let's look at Sunak's compromises. Let's start with the obvious one first, and let's talk about Suella Braverman, who the media are dubbing Leaky Sue because of the recent scandals about her leaking confidential documents. Now I'm going to start with an apology here, because this is going to seem a bit more like a personal attack than anything else, and I don't like doing that sort of thing. However, in this scenario, it is important to really dig into just how big a compromise Suella Braverman represents to Rishi Sunak. And so I need to talk about her personal attributes as part of that. So to get the really obvious bit out of the way first, Suella Braverman is probably the most bigoted, the most racist and the most obnoxious minister currently in Rishi Sunak's cabinet. She's an extremely divisive figure, and whilst that itself represents a bit of a problem for Rishi Sunak, because it will create division, it will create quite a lot of opposition to him and his policies just by her mere presence and the way that she antagonises people, it actually goes a lot further than that. Because what we have seen in Suella Braverman, it not only does she represent a particular faction that itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to easily compromising, she herself is a liability, quite frankly, to anyone. And the reason for that is not only just because she leaks documents to her faction, and that was as a deliberate act to undermine then Truss government, but she is also an individual that seemed very emotive and unable to control herself. And we can see that in the way that she attacks wokeism, the way that she expresses anti-immigration policies and so on. For any politician, even if they hold their views, they usually have enough self-control to make sure that those views are expressed in a way to garner as much support as possible. That does not appear to be Suella Braverman's way. So what that means is that she's not a team operator. She's not going to be a trusted part of the cabinet. The other cabinet members are not going to trust her, not if they've got any sense. They also know that she's going to antagonise a lot of people. And whilst that might be fun to watch on TV, it completely goes against how governments work. Governments work on the basis of getting consensus for policies, getting people to buy in to what it is you're trying to achieve. And it's very hard to see how Braverman is going to secure that buy-in. It's especially hard if she has a reputation for undermining the leadership, then she's not someone you want on your side, quite frankly. So we all know that Rishi Sunak has had to compromise to put her into the cabinet in order to secure the support of that particular wing of the Conservative Party. But this is a clear area or clear compromise that is going to cause him a lot of headaches. And Labour have already recognised this, and this is why we can see that Labour are already targeting her very specifically, because they know she is a weak link in Rishi Sunak's cabinet. And so they will be trying to chip away at that link as much as possible to undermine Rishi Sunak. So he's going to have to find ways of managing that. And either he reins Braverman in, gets her to behave in a way that appears more professional, more conducive to being able to get policy messages out, or he finds a way of getting rid of her, a nice plausible way of, oh whoops, she committed too many security breaches and out she goes. But again, if he has to do that, he has to also assess the implications of that against the faction of the party that she represents, and finds a way of making sure that getting rid of Braverman doesn't undermine his ability to count on their support. So it's hard not to argue that his compromise here in accepting her may perhaps be more trouble than it is worth. And time will tell, and we'll see just how much control and influence that particular chunk of the Conservative Party is able to influence over Rishi Sunak. So let's turn to some of the political compromises facing Sunak, of which the first obvious one is balancing the cabinet. To keep the Conservative Party on board, he has had to draw high-profile individuals from each of the various wings of the Conservative Party and put them into his cabinet, whether he wants them there genuinely or not. And this is important. Any Prime Minister, in any democratic system actually, has to do this. Liz Truss did not do this. She was very uncompromising, and she only filled her cabinet with people that she particularly wanted there. She didn't make any effort whatsoever to compromise with the other wings and to balance her cabinet. And as a consequence of that, she lost control of the Conservative Party extremely quickly. People like Boris Johnson and now Rishi Sunak are keenly aware of the importance of having everybody represented at levels of your government. This is to secure their support, this is to allow policies to be argued for and then to be taken forward with everyone appearing to be in agreement. And I say appear because of course there will always be disagreements, but it is essential that when it comes to being public facing, that everybody looks like they are in agreement. And this is something I tell people is extremely important in any negotiation. You do not want to be undermined in negotiation by someone on your own side visibly disagreeing with you. So part of this whole process, Rishi Sunak is going to have to mediate between the various different wings of his party. And that's not just in terms of balancing the cabinet, but also in terms of the policies that he pursues. So he might have to have quite a right-wing policy in there. Let's say anti-immigration is one, and that can be represented by Braverman. But he might also need to have more centrist policies, let's say social welfare type policies. And people like Hunt can perhaps represent that wing of the Conservative Party. So all the way through, Sunak is going to be having to mediate and balance those competing interests. And by giving a little bit to every side, he is going to be able to essentially secure their support for all his policies, not just the ones that they like. This, of course, works on the assumption that all the various wings are willing to work together and willing to compromise on their desires for the common purpose, the common purpose of the Conservative Party. If, of course, those wings completely refuse to compromise, then this delicate balancing act starts to fall apart for Sunak. So he's going to have to work very hard to make sure that that does not happen. And part of how he can do that, in some ways, is by sticking to the Conservative manifesto. And this solved two particular problems for him. One of is that of mandate. He obviously wasn't Boris Johnson at the time in 2019, so he, rightly or wrongly, people tend to perceive the manifesto as giving them the personal mandate, and Sunak does not have that. So he has to stick quite closely to the spirit, not necessarily the letter, of the manifesto in order to make sure that he can have a reasonable claim to a mandate. But the second thing is that this cuts down some of the arguments amongst the various wings, because he will point to the manifesto and he will say to them, this is what we got elected on. Now we can argue on how best to implement these manifesto promises, but fundamentally everyone has to be seen to be delivering on them, otherwise we are very much undermined politically as a party. And that's going to help him a little bit as part of that mediation process, because that's going to give the various wings a certain focus, something to focus on. They will all see what the promises are, what the objectives are, because it is written down. And I stress this in any kind of negotiation. You always want to have it agreed and written down, what your objectives are. Because when things get difficult further on down the line, you can point to it and say, well, this is the objective, this is what we all agreed we should be trying to achieve. And whilst there will be differences in opinion on how to do that, right now that manifesto is the best tool that Sunak has for keeping all the wings together. So that's why he's going to stay rigidly focused on that, because if he fails to do that, then the pressure on him to call a general election will increase. And the various wings of the Conservative Party know this, and they too do not want a general election, because that is extremely risky to them. They are very likely to lose an awful lot of their MPs. So by staying focused on this way, he's able to mediate, he's able to stifle dissent, he's able to maintain some kind of cohesion. But this is a delicate balancing act, because if any of the particular sort of subgroups of the Conservative Party decide that they don't want to stick to the manifesto, then he's going to have quite a problem. And even with doing all this, even with keeping the whole party pretty much on the same page, Sunak is still going to have the problem in that he has to maintain the support of various groups who themselves may not be closely aligned to the manifesto. Let's do a brief dive into Conservative donors, for example, who as a general rule tend to be ultra-wealthy individuals. There's a bit of a strange game in British politics, which is that the parties get elected on the manifesto commitments, but really they have two groups of people they have to keep happy. The electorate, to keep them in power, to keep voting for them, but also the donors, who will give their money in return for something. And that something is, of course, never explicitly stated. It's never, openly, clearly exposed to the light of day so people can see that. But we do know that the Conservative Party is very much reliant on that money. And those donors can withdraw their support at any time. That includes if they consider that the Conservative Party is sticking to the manifesto commitments to such an extent that it harms their personal interest. So this could be the problem that Sunak finds himself in. It's going to be very hard to keep the manifesto commitments without perhaps going against the donor interest. And this is the position he's perhaps been forced in by the significant false promises and economic mismanagement left to him by Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Furthermore, he's also going to have to keep the media happy. And British media are notoriously lenient towards the Conservative Party and usually quite critical of the Labour Party. And this is a broad brush statement, not always true, of course. But on balance, that seems to be what generally happens. But they can turn at any time, and they certainly did against Liz Truss. So Sunak will know that he wants to keep, it's not just a case of keeping their coverage favourable to him. It's also the case that he needs them not to tell the truth. That is a very cynical way of putting it. But he needs them not to expose all the fallacies in his plans and his policies, the fallacies of the Conservative position, the sheer economic reality of what the Conservative have done to the British economy and to the British political framework. He needs the media not to be too public about those flaws. Because if they do decide to start exposing them with more coverage, then that's going to cause him significant problems in terms of the voter base. So he needs to find ways to keep them happy, to avoid them getting too critical. And then of course, finally, but not necessarily least, or certainly not top as people might like to think, is those opinion polls of the public at large. Because right now it is very clear that the British public do not like the Conservative Party. They may personally favour Sunak, but they are very much against the Conservative Party as a whole, and this reflects the political and economic situation that the UK is currently in. So Sunak is in this very awkward position of all these very different people to please. Now he could take the view that the electorate is lost and that keeping the party and the donors and the media happy in the short term is more important. But that tends to undermine his authority. So he needs to find ways of making the electorate not only personally approve more of him, but also be less anti the Conservative Party. And that's going to be important for maintaining his authority, maintaining discipline within the Conservative Party. But balancing all those interests is not going to be easy, because what could please the electorate may well not please the donors, the Conservative Party, for example. And with that, so he has that compromise of perhaps more political support and less money, or more money and less political support. And it'll be interesting to see how he balances that going forward. Now let's turn to the economic compromises that Sunak's going to make. And in many ways, this actually represents even more of a threat to him than people might think. Because I know what many people are thinking. They're thinking that Sunak, as a former Chancellor, as a former an investment banker and that sort of thing, he has lots of personal credibility in this respect. And whilst that might be true, the reality is it makes him more vulnerable to any failures. So if he cannot balance out these economic compromises, then his personal credibility is going to take a massive hit. He is not someone who's a big political operator like Boris Johnson was. He doesn't have that personal kind of credibility. All his credibility is linked to his ability to manage economic matters, finances and so on. So any hits on that will hit him far harder than it would, for example, someone like Boris Johnson, who had more political credibility. God knows how, but he did. So Sunak is going to have to be really careful with what he does in terms of his economic decisions. And in many ways, his first big problem is this whole issue of economic growth versus inflation. Now, Liz Truss, in some ways, kind of let the cat out of the bag. She said the unsayable, or because she was not particularly smart. And she pointed out, quite accurately, quite truthfully in fact, that the UK had very poor economic growth. Of course, she wasn't quite stupid enough to really highlight the fact that a lot of that was from the last 12 years that the Conservative Party had been in charge, plus a couple of years before that due to the financial crisis. So there's very much a linkage at this point in time in the media narrative between the Conservative Party and poor economic growth for the UK. Those two are very much, linked together. So Sunak has turned up after this big reveal. And of course, to fix economic growth, as anyone with any understanding of economics will know, you need to do things like improve infrastructure, improve capital, improve access to money, improve access to labour. And I'll come on to all of that. But essentially what that means is spending more money. Unfortunately, the government spending more money, if not done in a very precise way, tends to lead to more inflation. Inflation is very much linked to economic growth. And Sunak was also right earlier this year when saying that inflation would massively harm everybody's living standards as well as the economy as a whole. So this is the really obvious area of compromise that he has got right now, in that in some ways he needs to dampen down spending and costs in particular in order to get inflation down. Unfortunately, and certainly in the short term, that is going to mean his ability to generate economic growth is going to be extremely limited. And unfortunately, economic theory says that government spends money on capital projects and so on. But that is not necessarily what Conservative ideology would like to do. So he's going to struggle very much to reconcile those two opposing forces in terms of any economic policies that he pursues. Which leads on to the next issue, which is that he's got to improve investor confidence. Because one of the reasons why the UK had such poor economic growth is because no one particularly wants to invest in the UK economy. This was a bit of a problem before Brexit, but ever since the Brexit vote, it is extremely striking that from 2016 onwards, foreign investment into the UK has first gradually and increasingly sharply reduced. So Sunak needs to find a way to increase investment into the UK. And when you don't have external investors willing to pour money in, then that is the role of government. The government is meant to be the big organisation, certainly at the last resort, that will turn up and invest in the things that need investing to create growth. However, as Liz Truss found out, attempting to create a large amount of money to do so without detailing where that money is going to come from, or I suppose perhaps to say balancing the books, is a problem. And so her policy was utterly ludicrous in the extreme, hence it created such a strong reaction. But the problem for Sunak is that the problem hasn't gone away. He's still got to find ways of generating more money, but in a way that doesn't undermine confidence in the UK government in its ability to pay off debt. So his options for doing that are not necessarily going to be easy. Another crucial part of any economic revival is that of labour. For the economy to get better, Sunak needs the British workforce to work more. And that is going to be difficult. Not just because unionism is very much on the rise, and because of the inflation issues, there's a lot of unrest. There's a lot of people who are quite justifiably pointing out that their wages are not going as far as they want, or they need to, really, to survive, to cope with the cost of living. But this comes back to the previous point. Sunak is going to struggle to generate more money. So if he cannot generate more money, how is he going to meet those wage demands? And if he cannot meet those wage demands, how is he going to get British workers to be more productive? Because obviously being forced to work whilst being paid what you consider, insufficient salary doesn't exactly make for a very motivated workforce. So he's going to have that particular problem. Now, the traditional ways that governments have normally managed to fix that is through increased immigration, particularly cheap labour. Unfortunately for Sunak, not only has he got a bit of a Brexit problem when it comes to immigration, but he also has a rabid, crazy anti-immigration Home Secretary in the form of Braverman, who is dead set against any immigration. So, in terms of what Sunak has to do, if he were to pursue, he either has to resolve the labour disputes to get people back to work, or he has to import cheap immigrants, presumably not from Europe, courtesy of Brexit, and possibly he might be able to strike a trade deal with countries like India for their cheap labour, and this was very much a key objective that Liz Truss and Boris Johnson were pursuing. The Indian government wasn't necessarily being cooperative, shall we say. Maybe Sunak may have more success in his negotiations with the Indian government. But if he is successful on that front, then he is on a direct collision course with the right wing of the Conservative Party, who have a very strong anti-immigration bias. So if he panders to their desires, then he can't import immigration. But he also probably can't really be seen to be negotiating or compromising with the union, because that again would undermine his standing within the Conservative Party. So I don't know really how he's going to resolve this Labour problem. All the traditional options seem to be denied to him. And it'll be interesting to see what he does to deal with those particular problem. And of course, last but certainly not least, British companies are having an extremely bad time. And the reason why is that everything they import is getting more expensive. And their ability to export has been severely curtailed. So last I saw the statistics, UK export had fallen by over 14 or nearly 14%. And imports had increased dramatically as a consequence, but it's also got more expensive courtesy of the issues with Ukraine and global supply chain and war-related issues. So to resolve this, what Sunak needs to do is find ways for imports to get cheaper, which is going to be very difficult to do because he cannot control global events, or reduce imports. But again, that requires investment. So for example, instead of importing gas for your energy needs, you produce your energy within the UK. But that requires significant money and investment, which Sunak probably doesn't have. So that's that part of the equation he's going to struggle to fix. And when it comes to exports, well, he is not going to fix the export problem by agreeing a whole host of very poor trade deals with a variety of countries around the world. That has already been tried, that has already failed. So really, if Sunak wants to improve the economic prospects for British industry, he's going to need to find a way to increase UK exports to key markets such as the US and to Europe. And right now there's a whole load of Brexit reality that is stopping him from doing it. There's the fact that he cannot be seen to be renegotiating the trade and cooperation agreement. He cannot be seen to capitulate on the Northern Ireland Protocol issue. He cannot be seen to agree to the EU's demand for, as part of any single market access, for the free movement of capital and labour. So again, he is very much out of options here unless he, through discreet or more overt means, tackles some of the harsh realities that Brexit has imposed upon his ability to fix these economic problems. And again, if he does any of that, he is going to anger quite a significant chunk of the Conservative Party, who of course are ideologically very strongly aligned to Brexit. So what conclusion can we really draw from this? Well, let's make the assumption to start with that Sunak is a bit of an economic genius. Let's say he gets all the economic calls right, it's all consistent, and he is able to very competently reassure the market and make good financial and economic decisions for the UK. Even if that assumption is true, the problem is it is not enough. It's not enough for him just to be a competent Prime Minister that's good at making economic decisions. He needs to be a much better political operator. And this is because if he cannot keep all the disparate wings of his party together and in agreement with his plans and his economic policies, and to keep the wider economy happy as well, then his policies cannot be implemented, at least not effectively. And he will find himself being blocked or being, stuck in squabbles and so on. And it's going to be so difficult to see how he's going to square away what people want ideologically and what the economy actually requires in terms of going back to economics fundamentals. Now, you'd assume that Sunak would know this. He's not at all a stupid guy. He had a successful career in banking. One presumes he knows quite a bit about economics and other financial matters. But that is just not going to be enough if no one else is willing to compromise with him or to align with what he says needs to be done. So that is one of the big problems that he is going to have. The other one that he's also going to have is that he has come into this role as a fixer. He is, in a way, a compromise candidate. He wasn't, he didn't win an election to become Prime Minister. So what that means is he doesn't have the personal mandate that he requires. Instead, he has to attach to the Conservative manifesto to provide him with that mandate. And unfortunately for him, whilst it's convenient in certain respects, it does remain the reality that he is still there as a fixer Prime Minister, attempting to deal with the mess caused by his predecessors. But it also means that he is not somebody that can set out a strategic vision or objective. He can't deviate from the manifesto to put his own personal stamp on things and say, this is what I am going to do to drastically improve the UK, to put my mark on it, to make the UK economy and the UK politics as a whole in some way better. He's going to really struggle to communicate that vision because of the circumstances by which he's taken his role and because of the people that he has to mediate with and keep on board. They will restrict his ability to do very much quite significantly. And so this leads to the final point, that even for him to be moderately successful as a Prime Minister, like any Prime Minister, he needs to keep everybody on the same page. He needs his whole cabinet to be perfectly in tune with him. No bad discipline, no back briefings, no undermining of his leadership. And considering the makeup of his cabinet, that is going to be interesting. But he also needs the wider party to back him as well, and to put their differences aside, not to fight amongst themselves. And he also needs all the other key stakeholders, whether that be donors, whether that be media, and the electorate at large, to also be quite supportive of what he sets out to do. Because if he fails in any of those communication areas, then again, it doesn't matter if he's making the right economic decision. He's going to really struggle to get people on board with what it is he needs to do. So in short, to succeed in this role, Sunak not only needs to be smart on economic matters, he needs to be one hell of a negotiator to navigate all the compromises and competing interests. And I have to say that at this point, I've not seen any evidence of that. He must have some skills. There's no way he could have got to that role. Famous last words, of course, because Truss was obviously an abject failure, yet somehow she did get to that role. So he needs to sharpen his political skills, sharpen his negotiation skills to quite a significant degree if he is to have any hope whatsoever of being successful, and not to be overwhelmed and to lose control as the result of all the compromises that he is going to have to make in going forward. So I hope you found this video helpful and insightful. I look forward to seeing the comments below. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content.